Welcome to the Darkstream, Voxday, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. Thanks for tuning it in, all of you who are not on your way to Bertaria. Audio's good, video's good, unauthorized chat is rolling, DLive chat is rolling, and super chats are active. Speaking of super chats, I'm going to address today a question that was brought up by several people on Social Galactic a few days ago. Now that I've got the first draft of A Sea of Skulls done, I am starting to work on the Sociosexual Hierarchy book. And, that's probably going to lead to some more discussions of it on the Darkstream, on the blog, and so forth. If you want to follow anything that pops up on Gab, I've actually got a separate account devoted specifically to SSH called Sigma Game. So if you look up Sigma Game, you can find it. So the question came up from some guys who I believe more or less identify themselves as deltas. In response to something that I said with regards to the way in which that deltas don't handle strategy very well. That, one of the reasons that deltas struggle when they find themselves put in a leadership role is because of their fundamental delta perspective not necessarily being in line with the perspective that is required for a leader who is supposed to provide direction to the group. Now, this shouldn't be taken as a general criticism of deltas in any way. I've said this many times, I'll say it again, it'll be made clear in the book. Deltas are not only the most numerous type of men, they're the most important type of men. Nothing gets done without deltas. We got a bunch of volunteers for ArcTunes recently, but one of the reasons why most of them didn't work out the way that the production team might have hoped is because, we don't have enough deltas. Deltas get stuff done. Deltas don't come in like the nerd brigade in Ukraine saying, I'll come to Ukraine and help and tell you what to do. Deltas don't tell anybody what to do. They do it themselves. And they do it competently. And they get the job done. That's why they're so valuable. Now, obviously, there's some downsides to being delta, especially when it comes to dealing with the opposite sex, but that's not relative here. It's not relevant here. What we're talking about is within a group, whether it's a corporation, an organization, a group of people that come together in order to accomplish certain collective goals. And here's the reason that strategy is so difficult for the delta. Because the average delta, by virtue of the way that he has to think in order to accomplish his objectives, the delta is necessarily focused on himself. He doesn't think a lot about other people in the context of what he is doing and what he's supposed to be doing. For those of you who are deltas, when you are given a task, how many of you spend any time thinking about what other people have to do, except in how it directly impacts your ability to do what you're supposed to do? I'm guessing not very much. You know, if you ask a Delta what he's concerned about, he's first concerned about doing his job correctly. He's concerned about doing the right thing, about being seen to have done the right thing. And, you know, that's not narcissistic, but it is self-centered. Again, we're not criticizing here. We're analyzing. We're looking at the way that people actually observably behave. You know, when I'm talking to a Delta about the task that he has to do, one of the things that's interesting is that he has no interest whatsoever in what I'm doing. He has no interest whatsoever in what other people on the team are doing. He's focused on holding up his end of the program, his end of the job, his end of the coffin, whatever you want to call it. You know, his focus is doing his job correctly, and then, you know, he usually wants respect for having done his job correctly. Now that's a good thing. That's a necessary thing. That's something that we could definitely use more people doing. You know, there's nothing more frustrating when you're a project leader than telling somebody to do something and then having them start asking questions about stuff that has nothing to do with them. Because you know, and we're usually talking about gammas here, you know that they're not going to do what they're supposed to do, and they're probably going to blame their failure to do what they're supposed to do on somebody else. Deltas don't do that. And that's good, but that's not good when your role involves not just thinking about what other people do, but planning what other people are going to do. And this is where Deltas get themselves in trouble, because their, whether you want to call it inability or distaste or disinclination, whatever word triggers you least, because of their disinclination to think about other people performing their tasks, the Delta is usually going to take on too much work himself. He's going to try to get it done himself. And he's not going to want to spend any time thinking about what Delta 2, Delta 3, Delta 4, Gamma 1, Gamma 2, he doesn't want to spend any time thinking about that. He actually resists being forced to do so, and if promoted to that position, will come to resent it probably very quickly. That's why they talk about the Peter Principle. The Peter Principle is the idea that everybody gets promoted into failure. You take a really good programmer with no people skills, and instead of using him to program, you make him a programming manager. So now he's not doing any programming, and he is having to waste his time trying to tell other people what to do, which he doesn't want to do, doesn't care about doing, and cannot do well. That's just one example. And I think that this is also another example of why it's fundamentally a mistake to look at the hierarchy, to look at the patterns of behavior or the rank or whatever you want to call it, and envy those who are at the top. Speaking of people at the top, Sam Freeman points out Bill Belichick values deltas. Bill Belichick's mantra at practice is famous. They put it up in big, huge letters on the scoreboard. Do your job. Now, really, that's not a message for the deltas. That's a message for all the non-deltas, telling them, don't worry about what the guy next to you is supposed to do. You do your job. You leave it up to me, the alpha, to make sure that everybody else is doing what they're supposed to be doing, to do all the appropriate planning, and to hold other people accountable. But if we think about this, if we take this principle, this observed principle that deltas don't do strategy, we begin to understand why they have a difficult time in relationships with women. Because one thing that I've noticed with deltas in particular, when they have a problem in a relationship, what do? Can anyone tell me what a delta does when he runs into relationship problems? There's a very consistent pattern of behavior here that also correlates to what we were just talking about within the organization. Q1882 gets part. He says, works harder at saving it. Yes, that's a broader way of putting it. No, asking for advice is not generally common. Servant says works. Tries to fix it himself. Exactly. The delta doesn't know how to hold anybody else accountable. Remember, he's focused on not only doing his job correctly, he's not only focused on bearing up his responsibilities, but he's also interested in order to be seen to do the right thing. You know, when you see a guy whose wife gets arrested for something that involves some kind of sexual impropriety, whether it's a school teacher having an affair with a 16-year-old student, or whether it's a woman who works at a bank, and it comes out that she and her vice president lover have embezzled money or something. Whenever you see a husband standing by his wife in these utterly absurd, obviously marriage-destroying situations, you can be pretty confident that if you were to look into the guy's life, you'd find out that he was a delta. You know, I mean, deltas practically define the concept of carrying the cross. And that's why I'm saying this is not a negative trait. We're simply describing what is. You know, sometimes this stuff is heroic, right? But, and you knew there was a but coming, that doesn't mean that it is always the optimal strategy. You know, for example, and this is where this subject came up. A guy was talking about how his wife's son had had an affair, and she'd left. They've got some kids. The husband, who's a good guy, probably a Delta, talked her into coming back, even though she's like not necessarily willing to even try to save the marriage. Now, the problem is that he's doing it, of course, for the kids. He's willing to make any sacrifice for the kids. They're his world. Blah blah blah, frickin' blah. Right? And all this stuff, it's that the guy is saying, it's real, but it's also performance art. It's Delta performance art. Because the Delta not only has the desire to do the right thing, the Delta not only has his patterns of behavior upon which he automatically relies, but he also needs to be seen to be doing the right thing. He needs to be the good guy. This, by the way, on a side note, is really destructive when you have it in a lawyer. In one situation, we worked with a Delta lawyer, and he genuinely believed that if you just showed the judge that you were the more reasonable party and you were a good guy and that sort of thing, the judge would rule for you. I pointed out to him that this just didn't work that way, and he said, I'm beginning to question my entire career at this point. And again, it's not that these instincts are bad. They're not. They're good instincts. It's good to be loyal. It's good to be responsible. It's good to attempt to do a proper, competent job. These are all good. But in some contexts and in some situations, it becomes suboptimal. The Delta begins to harm his own interests. How does it harm somebody's interest in the situation we were talking about with the unfaithful wife and the kids and that sort of thing? Because if he goes into the negotiation saying that he'll do anything, he's given up negotiating ground. And I can guarantee you that any woman who is, that shameless, any woman who's that willing to break up a marriage over, momentary attraction to somebody else, is going to take every inch of ground and use that as a starting point. See, what Deltas try to do is they try to preemptively cut the difference. They try to preemptively say, well, I could be over here, but I'm going to come all the way to here and create a good example for you to meet me there. Meanwhile, the woman, the non-Delta, says, oh, well, that's your starting point. Okay, we'll split the difference from there. So instead of ending up at 50% where he thought he was going to be, he ends up at 25%. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in law. It doesn't work in relationships. It doesn't work in business. Maybe it works on occasions where you've got two Deltas, like maybe in a business deal where you've got two Deltas. Maybe that works out. Maybe. But it definitely doesn't work out when you've got an Alpha and a Delta, when you've got a Delta and a woman, and so forth. And so, what's the correct thing to do for the Delta in these situations? Well, what he needs to do is get advice from people who are better at strategy, from people who are better at looking at a situation and not primarily being worried that everybody's going to think you're the good guy. That doesn't mean that you have to be the bad guy. That doesn't mean that you have to be disloyal. That doesn't mean that you have to do anything wrong. You know, I'm not saying, oh, be shady, whatever, but get advice from someone who is capable about thinking about more than how you're going to look at any moment. Especially to those who are on the other side. I mean, if your primary goal is to look like a good and reasonable person to your enemy, you are going to lose every single time. You know, it's really frustrating when you're talking to a Delta, because anything out, I mean, when you're trying to give them advice, whether it's solicited or not, it's actually very similar to trying to talk to somebody who strongly prefers dialectic about rhetoric. The person who strongly prefers dialectic thinks all forms of rhetoric are dishonest, which means that they will completely fail to communicate to anyone who's limited to rhetoric. If you think all forms of Chinese are dishonest and refuse to speak Chinese, you cannot talk to anyone who speaks only Chinese. I mean, it was amusing. Just today, there were two people on Social Galactic who criticized the very popular and effective meme comparing Nagasaki to Detroit. You know, they said, well, this meme would have been more effective if it had used a different picture of Detroit, because that would have been more accurate. Right, because that's the most important thing about memes, accuracy. I just said, look, you guys don't understand rhetoric. The question is not how accurate are the details of the meme. It's, does the meme emotionally manipulate in a manner that points towards the truth or points away from the truth? In this case, it pointed toward the truth. You can use honest dialectic to create misleading rhetoric that points away from the truth. You can use what is dialectically false. You can use pure falsehood and emotionally manipulate toward the truth. In the same way, the Delta needs to understand that the same toolbox doesn't work in all situations for all people. The Delta toolbox is great. We need more Delta toolboxes. We need more people who know how to use the Delta toolboxes properly. But just as alpha behavior is necessary but is inappropriate in a lot of situations, the Delta toolbox is not applicable to everything. You know, when I was working, I was brought in to fix a game called Age of Conan. It's one of my many mistakes along the way. I was offered a position on the board of directors, which I should have just taken. I mean, all I had to do was say, yeah, that sounds great. But instead I had to go into, now I'm not a Delta, but I did go into problem solving mode. And I told them, look, you can find anybody to read the financial reports and tell you what's good and what's bad. I said, you actually need me more as a game designer than you do as a board member. They're like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. So they hired me to come up with a design fix, which I did. The problem is that the guy who would have implemented it, who was a very smart guy and was a wildly overworked guy, he was both the lead designer and the lead producer, and he actually quit the day that I started. Had nothing to do with me, but the problem is they and I've told this before, they promoted the guy who'd been the head of Anarchy Online, a game that was, just chugging along on his old user base. They promoted him to be the head guy for Age of Conan. Well, he's a producer. He was a Delta. What was his solution to everything? Well, not everything runs perfectly, so let's fix all the bugs. I mean, you don't make a game more appealing to play to people who are not playing it by fixing the bugs. And notice how similar his response to dealing with the game issue is similar to the Delta's response to dealing with a relationship issue. If I just work harder. No, you have to change what you're doing. You have to work differently, ideally smarter, but you absolutely have to work differently. More of the same isn't going to solve anything. Shadowhand says sometimes the bugs create fun. Yeah, that's irrelevant though. I mean, that's not the point. The point is that if the game isn't fun enough, if the game doesn't appeal enough to convince new players to try it, then you need to make the game more fun and come up with new features and new concepts that will appeal to the potential new players and bring them in. It's a fundamental category error to say, well, we just need to do exactly what we're doing before, only more perfectly. That'll never work. And so, Swedish Trash Panda says, bug fixing is great for good games with flaws. Of course. If you don't have a good game at the core, or I wouldn't say good game at the core, if you don't have an attractive game at the core, you're just cementing failure. Same thing in relationships. Improving on your little flaws is great for a strong relationship where the parties have some flaws. But if you don't have a strong relationship, then fixing your little flaws is just cementing failure. Cliff Cosmic asks, would it be appropriate to describe deltas as stubborn? Absolutely, 100%. Exterminator Bear says, Vox, with pursuing relationships, a friend's advice was specifically, don't be you. It's not working. I told him I'm not. Maybe you told him that, but, what did you actually change? I mean, what the thing that I personally find frustrating when I talk to deltas about relationship issues is that they first tell you, things are going badly. And then you say, okay, well, maybe you need to change this and change this and change that. And then they will promptly explain to you why those things don't need to be changed because their behavior is optimal. Changing anything would only make it worse. And while that's theoretically possible, it's pretty unlikely, especially when you see the same pattern over and over and over and over and over again. And because I mean, we have these patterns of behavior for a reason. We move into those patterns because that's what's comfortable for us. And sometimes it really screws you up. I mean, I was wildly, totally, and completely unprepared for a marital relationship. And that was directly related to my Sigma pattern of behavior. It's probably not that hard to guess. What does a Sigma do when there's any sort of problem that is sufficiently irritating to him? Sigmas just move on. Next. Well, guess what? That is neither appropriate nor effective once you get married. It's literally impossible. I mean, you would what are you going to do? Get a divorce every time somebody disagrees with you about something? So, I wouldn't say that I'm particularly good at it, but at least I'm not totally dysfunctional like my pattern of behavior would have been. I mean, I quickly recognized, okay, I need a new strategy here, because the way that I've behaved my entire life is no longer viable. So that's why I'm so confident when I tell deltas that, hey, you can change your pattern of behavior within a relationship or within an organization. Because I did. I had to learn to. If your pattern of behavior is inappropriate, ineffective, or totally impossible, you have no choice but to try something else. And the problem for the Delta is that there is a reward that he'll get from other people. And there's a reward that he will give himself. And, he will tell himself, she'll see how hard I'm working. She'll see how much I care. And that's when you say, have you ever met a woman? She probably won't see it. She definitely won't care. So that's not going to work. OG Fem says, I've noticed more men telling other guys to stop simping and changing their behavior. Well, we're not talking about simping here. That's a different issue. But in terms of the grasping the fact that they need to change their behavior, that's good. VFM Bear says, am I the only one thinking about deltas and churchianity right now? I think that deltas are, I think deltas can be susceptible to churchianity. But to be honest, I think that churchianity is so bad and has gotten so outrageous that one of the problems in the church is that the deltas have been driven out. The number of Christians who and legitimate real Christians who never set foot in a church is much higher than you'd believe, and is growing. It's always funny to me when atheists are celebrating the fact that the number of people in churches is down. It's like, yeah, that doesn't mean that people are abandoning Jesus Christ or abandoning Christianity. It just means that the churches are converged. Beardy Bear says, and the women lead with or without ordination. That's correct. And yes, the deltas are more inclined to let them do it. It's the deltas and gammas that accept female leadership. Alphas absolutely reject it. At least they reject following it. One of the problems with alphas is that they love having women around. So they're happy to, they're happy to have an entire female board of directors and all female vice presidents. But that's just because the alpha likes to have harems around him. And also that's a short-sighted alpha because, we all know what's going to happen to the organization. What does an angry delta look like? The things that really set deltas, the thing that really sets deltas off is a lack of respect. They don't necessarily just work harder. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do the whole, you're treating me badly, I'll show you how valuable I am. That is one of the ways they do it. But not usually if they're not shown any respect. If you disrespect a delta, if you fail to give him what he really craves, he will go and work hard for somebody else. What question should a delta ask himself to correct course? Well, the number one question is the same question that everyone should ask. Are the consequences of my actions and decisions the consequences that are the consequences of my action and decisions consistent with my objectives? Now it's important to understand that in the context of relationships, it takes two to tango. There are some things you can never fix. There are some things that it doesn't matter what you do, the issue will not be resolved because it's not your issue. So as long as it's understood that some things don't have anything to do with you, or they're just beyond your influence, then I think it's important to say, okay, I've done X, I've done Y, I've done Z, and this, I ended up here. That's not where I want to be. So I'm going to, can I alter X, can I alter Y, or can I alter Z? And if I do one of those things, where is it likely to take me? But again, remember, deltas don't do strategy well. So for deltas, if you're a delta and you find yourself in need of working through different possibilities, find a friend who has that capability and talk things through with them. and listen. When you are seeking advice, and you know what my advice is going to be. When you are seeking advice, shut the fuck up and listen. Don't explain. Well, that won't work. Things are different now. Well, that won't work. This person is different than that person. Well, that won't work. This situation is different. Okay, maybe you're right, but you don't know. Try it. You come up with a plan. You consider your various options. You choose what looks like the best of them, and you try it. If you keep deciding that your current behavior that is getting you where you don't want to be is optimal, you're just being retarded. It can't work. It won't work. It never works. I need to change the battery here, so hang on a second. Let me turn off the camera for a moment. I think I have another battery here. Okay, we may get an extreme close-up here, but we'll see. Oh, they're pretty good. Not bad. Sorry about that. Powers It Bear says, does Pareto principle apply to male-dominated jobs? You'd think higher percentage of deltas would skew it. Pareto principle it's just a general principle. Don't take that 80-20 rule too seriously. Yeah, if you got more deltas, then it should be more even. But that whole 80-20, it's just meant to be absolutely no quantitative analysis was involved in creating the 80-20 rule. It's just a rule of thumb. Rainline says, treat a delta badly and sometimes he will work harder to prove you wrong. I have absolutely done that before. Quelle surprise, the treatment didn't get better. No, it doesn't. It definitely doesn't. Do deltas lash out violently like omega shooters? No, as a general rule. Remember, deltas are always work-wise in demand, and they're always competent. So they always have other options. They might not fully recognize them. They may not want to take advantage of them, but they're there. Ironic Keyboard says, any advice for a Bravo in the role of an alpha? See if you can find an alpha. See if you can recruit an alpha to replace you. Other than that, I would say don't hesitate to be decisive and stop asking everybody what they think you should do. One thing I've noticed about Bravos is that they tend to like to do a lot of consulting. They like to actually, that's something that both Bravos and Deltas will do. This may sound a little contrary to what I was just saying, but they ask for too much advice. Like basically, they don't make any decisions themselves. They bring in consultants, ask them what they should do, and then do that so that they have somebody else to blame. So that's my, I guess that would be my main advice for a Bravo in the role of an alpha is bite the bullet and make the decisions aggressively. Because what you think of as being really aggressive decision making is like hesitant alpha. You you literally can't be too decisive as a Bravo. And that's true for that goes for deltas too, for who happen to find themselves put in an alpha position. What interview questions would you ask to find a delta? My first question would be does it drive you crazy to not have enough time to complete a job? Or do you enjoy being able to move on to the next project? I think that that is going to, um, you might get some false deltas that way, but we're not trying to weed out things. We're trying to determine potential deltitude. I think that anyone who says, I can't stand it when I'm not allowed to do a job properly. I mean, for crying out loud, you can probably tell a delta just by asking him to describe the last project that he completed. If he starts actually drawing out illustrations of the project, he's a delta. You know, the the gamma will, you know, come up with some long-winded wall of text about how it was this really important project and it would have worked really well if people had listened to him. you know. So deltas and bravos are also lovers of ESG? No, I don't think so. I mean, they just like having women around. I mean, both deltas and gammas tend to meet women through their environment. And so, their idea of being proactive about about meeting women is to try to encourage their environments to bring more women, surround them with more women. I mean, there's not an alpha in the world who is, trying to invite his girlfriend to play on his football team. But every single male group of comic book readers and war game players and all that stuff, their favorite thing is to try to get a girl to show up. Just total nonsense. What would you recommend a delta do when he's disrespected at work? I would explain the situation to that individual's superior. Generally, alphas recognize the value of deltas. I think my charger is not plugged in or something, so we're getting the battery thing. But we're already approaching the 1 hour mark. So anyway, I think let's call it for now. But hopefully this has been useful on the delta topic. We'll be dealing more with this, and we'll be dealing more with some of the other patterns of behavior as well in the next few weeks. So bears, enjoy your festival, and thanks to all of you for a great August for the library, and We'll see you at the next Darkstream on Vox Day, and this is the Darkstream.